Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. And please pardon me, I'm suffering from some laryngitis. Been overusing my voice quite a bit lately. And I'll do the best I can this morning, especially with such an important work, such an important book. Romanism and the Reformation by Grattan Guinness. An extraordinary book, and yesterday we concluded on page 173 the account of a man, William Lithgow, a Scotsman, who was tortured in the Inquisition of the Roman Catholic Church and somehow escaped to tell the story of how he was treated, how he was tortured in the Inquisition. And I won't repeat it all. It's too terrible. People will accuse me of fear-mongering, certainly. But nonetheless, the accusation belongs to Henry Grattan Guinness, who wrote this book and recorded this account. And as is my usual custom, I will back up for continuity purposes, just read the tail end of this so as to make sure that the recording at First Amendment Radio has continuity from one broadcast to the next. I'll continue about in the middle of page 173 if you're following along. Romanism and the Reformation, we're on the website entitled archive.org, and we're reading this book. And I hope by now that you've all found the link, the specific link that I've been mentioning, and you are reading right along with me. Now, the first full paragraph on page 173 of the book, the author writes, "And notwithstanding of my shivering lips," he's quoting this William Lithgow, who escaped, the Scotsman who escaped the Inquisition, to tell of the horrid tale. It says, "And notwithstanding my shivering lips in this fiery passion, my vehement groaning, and blood springing from my arms, my broken sinews, yea, and my depending weight on flesh-cutting cords, yet they struck me on the face with cudgels to abate and to cease the thundering noise of my wrestling voice. At last, being released from these pinnacles of pain, I was handfast set on the floor with this their ceaseless imploration, quote, confess, confess, confess in time, or thine inevitable torments ensue, unquote. Where, finding nothing for me but still innocent. Oh, I am innocent. Oh, Jesus, the Lamb of God, have mercy on me and strengthen me with patience to undergo this barbarous murder, unquote. Now, Grattan Guinness takes over. He says, enough. Here let the curtain drop. I should sicken you were I to pursue the subject further. It's too horrible, too damnable. Here in this paper, says Grattan Guinness, remember he's speaking before an audience, this is a lecture. He says, here in this paper, I have some of the ashes of the martyrs, some of their burned bones. I have bits of rusted iron and melted lead, which I took myself with these hands from the Quemadero in Madrid, Spain, the place where they burned the martyrs, not far from the Inquisition. It was in the year 1870 that I visited it, just before the great ecumenical council was held at Rome, by which the Pope was proclaimed infallible. I was in Spain that spring and visited the newly opened Quemadero Must have been a museum. I don't know what he's talking about here, but he calls it the Quemadero. I saw the ashes of the martyrs. I carried away with me some relics from that spot, which are now lying on this table. Hear me, though in truth I scarcely know how to speak upon this subject. I am almost dumb with horror when I think of it. I have visited the places in Spain, in France, in Italy, most deeply stained and dyed with martyred blood. I have visited the valleys of Piedmont. Now, I want to interject here at this point. He's referring to the Waldenses. They lived in the Alps, in the district known as Piedmont. H. Grattan Guinness actually went to the place. You remember when I read the book, the History of the Waldenses by James A. Wiley? Many references to Piedmont and the persecution of the poor Waldensian people, the God-fearing, Bible-believing, Bible-reading, Bible-preaching Waldenses who rejected the papacy and said that he is Antichrist. H. Grattan Guinness literally went there, where they were slaughtered by the Roman Catholic Church, by the crusade after crusade after crusade, launched by pope after pope after pope, with the intent to annihilate those God-fearing people from off the face of the earth. H. Grattan Guinness says, I have visited the valleys of Piedmont. I have stood in the shadow of the great cathedral of Seville, on the very spot where they burned the martyrs, or tore them limb from limb. I have stood breast deep in the ashes of the martyrs of Madrid, Spain. I've read the story of Rome's deeds. I've waded through the many volumes of history and of martyrology. I have visited, either in travel or in thought, scenes too numerous for me to name, where the saints of God have been slaughtered by papal Rome, that great butcher of bodies and of souls. I cannot tell you what I've seen, what I've read, what I have thought. I cannot tell you what I feel. Oh, it's a bloody tale. I have stood in the valley of Lucerna, where dwelt the faithful Waldenses, those ancient prophets, those ancient Protestants who held to the pure gospel all throughout the dark ages. That lovely valley with its pine-clad slopes, which Rome converted into a slaughterhouse. Oh, horrible massacres of gentle, unoffending, noble-minded men. Oh, horrible massacres of tender women and helpless children. Yes, ye hated them. Ye hunted them. Ye trapped them. Ye tortured them. Ye stabbed them. You stuck them on pits, on spits. Yes, indeed, they impaled the bodies of the Waldenses on sharpened sticks and set them in the ground. Ye stuck them on spits. Ye impaled them. Ye hung them. Ye roasted them. Ye flayed them. You cut them in pieces. Ye violated them. You violated the women. You violated the children. You forced flints into them and stakes and stuffed them with gunpowder and blew them up and tore them asunder limb from limb and tossed them over precipices and dashed them against the rocks. You have cut them up alive. Ye dismembered them. Ye racked, mutilated, burned, tortured, mangled, massacred holy men, sainted women, mothers, daughters, tender children, harmless babes, hundreds, thousands, thousands upon thousands. Ye sacrificed them in heaps, in hecatombs, turning all Spain, Italy, France, Europe, Christian Europe, into a slaughterhouse, a charnel house, an Akeldama. Oh, horrible, too horrible to think of. The sight dims, the heart sickens, the soul is stunned in the presence of the awful spectacle. O harlot, gilded harlot, with brazen brow and brazen heart, red are thy garments, red thine hands. Thy name is written in this book. God has written it. The world has read it. Thou art a murderess, O Rome. Thou art the murderous Babylon, Babylon the Great. Drunken, foully drunken, yea, drunken with the sacred blood which thou hast shed in streams and torrents. The blood of the saints and the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. Listen carefully. Now he says this. Were there nothing else by which to recognize thee, O persecuting Church of Rome? This dreadful mark would identify thee. If there were no other evidence that the papacy is the Antichrist of the Bible, the Antichrist of the Bible, and that the Roman Catholic Church is that whore seated upon the bloody scarlet beast in Revelation chapter 17, all you would need to know is the history of the bloody persecution of the saints of God by the Roman Catholic Church, and you would have your Antichrist. That alone would convince you. If you could see all the blood throughout history that had been shed by the Roman Catholic Church, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus, then you would know beyond any shadow of doubt who the Antichrist is. That alone would convince you. That's what H. Grattan Guinness is trying to tell you. Let me read again what he said. Were there naught else but by which to recognize thee, O persecuting Church of Rome, this dreadful work, the shedding of the blood of the saints and the martyrs of Jesus, would positively identify thee. That's what he's telling us. Were there naught else by which to recognize thee, O persecuting Rome, a Church of Rome, this dreadful mark would identify thee. That's all it would take to convince someone who never heard of Rome before, who knew nothing about the papacy, who knew nothing about Roman Catholic Church history, or church history at all. Someone who just simply appeared from nowhere. If you were to show them the blood that was shed by the Roman Catholic Church, And that alone, he would come to the conclusion on his own. This is the Antichrist spoken of in the Bible. He continues, he says, this is thy brand. By this we know thee. Thou art that foretold Babylon. We know thee by thy place. We know thee by thy proud assumptions, by the throne on which thou sittest, by those 7 hills, by the beast thou ridest, by the garment thou wearest, by the cup thou bearest, by the name blazoned on thy forehead, by thy kingly paramours, by thy shameless looks, by thy polluted deeds. But, chiefly by this, by thy prolonged and dreadful persecution of the saints, by those massacres, by the Inquisition, by the fires of that burning stake. Mark how its ruddy flames ascend. See how its accusing smoke goes up to heaven. In this sacred prophecy, behold thy picture. Read thy name. Read thy written doom. The French Revolution broke upon thee. It was merely a stage in thy judgment, and no more. The beast who carried thee for centuries in abject submission turned against thee, cast thee off, stripped thy garments from thee, rent thee with its horns. It was foretold it would be so. It is fulfilled. But that fulfillment is not the end. It is but the beginning of the end. Tremble, for thy doom is written of old. The hand upon the wall has written it. The finger of Almighty God has engraved it. Dreadful have been thy sins, and dreadful shall be thy punishment. Thou hast burned alive myriads of the members of Christ. Thou hast burned them to cinders and to ashes. Thy doom is to be burned. Thy doom is the appalling flame whose smoke ascends forever. I have done. Prophecy has spoken. History has fulfilled its utterance. Rome pagan ran its course. Rome papal took its place. Babylon the Great has risen, has reigned, has fallen. Her end is nigh. Come out of her, my people. Come out of her before the final judgment act in the great drama of the apostasy. Come out of her, saith the Lord, that ye be not partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues. For as a millstone cast by a mighty angel into the sounding deep, she shall with violence be thrown down, and shall be found no more at all forever. H. Grattan Guinness, a Protestant, a man who knew God, who knew Christ, and who knew Antichrist, and was not ashamed to proclaim it to the whole world. And he did it by prophecy and by history. And he did it for me. Would to God that there were an H. Grattan Guinness of our generation. But we're stuck with the seminarians, those who have been inseminated by the papacy, futurists, all of them. They would repudiate this truth that H. Grattan Guinness has just given us. Oh, H. Grattan Guinness, he's just a hater, an anti-Roman Catholic bigot. We need peace and unity in this world. We need to put away our differences with the Roman Catholic Church. We need to quit talking about the martyrs. We need to quit talking about the Protestants. We need to quit talking about this idea that the Pope is the Antichrist of the Bible. If we're ever going to have peace in this world, we have to come together. Not me. Never. Not me. And not any of God's children. It's not going to happen. Unity with Rome is the mark of apostasy. Unity with Rome is a complete and total repudiation not only of the Protestant Reformation, but a repudiation of every drop of blood that Rome has shed for nearly 2,000 years. I will not be a part of that kind of apostasy. Unity with Rome is the repudiation of Jesus Christ himself. And a replacement with one called the Antichrist in the Bible. Now, having concluded with my own comments at the end of Lecture 4 in this most magnificent Protestant work, I will continue now to Chapter 5, or Lecture 5 in this book. I wish this program today were 3 hours long and that my voice was strong enough to continue so that I could read this lecture in its totality in one sitting. But I can't. My voice wouldn't take it, and neither would my heart. We will begin with Lecture 5, entitled Interpretation and Use of These Prophecies in the Pre-Reformation Times. When we get back from the break, take notes. This is important information. We'll be back right after the message. An update on First Amendment Radio. It's my privilege and pleasure, my blessing to get to do this program every day. And if you've learned something from this book, if you've learned something from my commentary, if you wish to support this work and see it continue on First Amendment Radio, please support First Amendment Radio, who sponsors the program all by itself. It's First Amendment Radio that pays for everything I do. You should be handsomely compensated. Pray for Brother Nicholas and First Amendment Radio. Pray for me. First and foremost, prayer. The prayers of a righteous man availeth much, much more than silver and gold. But we do have bills to pay. Support First Amendment Radio if you wish Inquisition Update to continue. And if you wish to email me and contact me with questions or comments, you may do so via email at tom@seawaves.us, tom@seawaves.us. No more wasting time. This is the most powerful lecture in this entire book. My prayer to God is that while I read this book, while I read this lecture, Chapter 5, Lecture 5, that God would speak it to the marrow of your bones. If you think these lectures that H. Grattan Guinness gave the world in the late 1880s is not consequential to your life, then you would be sadly mistaken. The information that I'm about to give is the most consequential to every Christian life in this country and around the world. Lecture 5 is entitled, Interpretation and Use of These Prophecies in Pre-Reformation Times. He begins, Romanism foretold. Such has been our subject in the 4 previous lectures. The Scripture prophecy and the papal history. That a deep and widespread apostasy has taken place in the Christian church. That this apostasy has produced paganized forms of Christianity, the chief of which is that of the Romish Church. That the apostasy of the Romish Church has culminated in the papacy. That the papacy has lasted through long centuries and lords it over half of Christendom. That it has persecuted the faithful unto blood, striving for the destruction of the gospel of God as if it were deadly heresy, and for the extermination of the saints of God as of accursed heretics. That it would have been completely triumphant still, but for the glorious Protestant Reformation, which burst its bonds, emancipated the enslaved consciences of millions, and created a new departure in the convictions and actions of the world. Such are the facts with which history presents us. They are broad, unquestionable facts, which are so notorious as to be beyond all controversy, so long-lasting as to fill the records of 1,000 years. And that this great apostasy was foretold, that it was foretold ages before its accomplishment by Old Testament prophets and New Testament apostles. That Daniel, dwelling in Babylon, foretold it, and John, the exile in Patmos, and Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles, that these men, surrounded as they were by ancient heathenism, and knowing nothing by the evidence of their senses or by observation of the complete corruption of Christianity, which has since darkened the world as a long and awful eclipse of the Sun of Righteousness, that these men, prophets and apostles, living in antecedent times, should have predicted the extraordinary events which have come to pass, and should have painted them in vivid colors on the venerable pages of the writings that they have left us, and that those predictions have for 18 centuries confronted apostate Christendom with their accusations, and reflected as in a faithful mirror the entire history of its ways. This is the profound prophetic truth we have endeavored to elucidate. We have now to study the interpretation and use of these marvelous prophecies by the Christian church. How has the Christian church understood and employed them? Of what practical benefit have these prophecies been to her during the last 18 centuries? It is evident that they were written for her guidance, her protection, and her sanctification. The prophecies of Paul and John are addressed to the Christian churches. The voice of inspiration expressly invites the whole church to study them. And the church has obeyed this command. She has read, marked, learned, and inwardly digested the sure word of prophecy. What moral effect has it had upon her? To what extent has it guided her footsteps and sustained her hopes? If these prophecies have proved to be a mighty power in her history, if they have preserved the faith of the church in times of general apostasy, if they have given birth to great Reformation movements, if they have inspired confessors and supported martyrs at the stake, if they have broken the chains of priestcraft, superstition, and tyranny, and produced at last a return on the part of many millions of men to a pure primitive Christianity, they have answered their purpose and justified their position in the sacred scriptures of truth. Nor may we lightly esteem that interpretation which has produced such results. Had the prophecies been misinterpreted, applied otherwise than according to the mind of the Spirit, capital S, we cannot believe that they would have been thus productive of blessed consequences. The fact that, understood and applied as they were by the Reformers, they have produced spiritual and eternal good to myriads of mankind as a proof that they were rightly applied. For, quote, by their fruits ye shall know them, unquote, is true, not only of teachers, but of their teachings. Protestantism, with all its untold blessings, is the fruit of the historic system of interpretation. Let me stop now and make my own comments. I'm going to read the last sentence again, and I want you to think carefully what H. Grattan Guinness has just told you. Again, he said, Protestantism, with all its untold blessings, is the fruit of the historic system of interpretation. The historic system of interpretation. H. Grattan Guinness says Protestantism is historicism. He has just fired the first shot across the bow of the futurist system of interpretation of Bible prophecy. He has just told you that if you are not an historicist, if you do not interpret these prophecies of Daniel the prophet, Paul the apostle and prophet, and John the apostle and revelator of the book of Revelations, if you do not interpret it as it was meant, if you do not interpret it from the historicist system of interpretation, you can't be Protestant. You can call yourself a Protestant, but you can't be a Protestant. Because to be a Protestant is to be historicist in your interpretation of the prophecies of the Bible. Let me read it again so all of the listeners can hear it one more time and make sure that I have not added to or taken away anything from what this author has just said. Here's what he says, one more time. Protestantism, with all its untold blessings, is the fruit of the historic system of interpretation. Now he continues, on the other hand, all that leads us to expect that the sufferers under anti-Christian tyranny would correctly interpret the prophetic word written for their guidance and support prompts also the expectation that their persecutors would as surely wrongly interpret it. As apostate Jews wrongly interpreted the prophecies of the Old Testament, so should we expect apostate Christians wrongly to interpret those of the New. Let me read it again. The apostate Jews wrongly interpreted the prophecies of the Old Testament. So we should expect apostate Christians wrongly to interpret those of the New. In our study of the last 18 centuries of interpretation, we shall not expect to find the true interpretation thereof among the apostates, but among the faithful, not among the persecutors, but among the persecuted, not among those who have waged war against the gospel of Christ, but among those who have confessed its pure teachings and sealed that confession with their blood. We shall not be surprised to find antagonistic schools of prophetic interpretation, but on the contrary, we shall expect such. And we shall expect the apostates and the persecutors to belong to the one school, and the faithful confessors and martyrs to another. If an officer of justice arrests a man because he perceives that he answers exactly to a description of a notorious criminal published by the government as a help to his identification, is it likely that the man himself will admit that the description fits him? Well, he will, of course, deny the correspondence, but his denial will carry no weight. On turning to the history of prophetic interpretation, this is precisely what we find. With many varieties as to detail, we find there have existed and still exists two great opposite schools of interpretation: the papal and the Protestant, or the futurist and the historical. Let me read it again. There are two opposite schools of interpretations of the prophecies in the Bible. One is papal and the other is Protestant. One is futurist and the other historical. What do you think this author is about to tell you? that the papal interpretation of the Bible prophecies regarding the Antichrist are futurist. The papacy depends on the world adopting this futurist interpretation of the prophecies. Why? Because they exonerate the papacy. They take the onus of Antichrist away from the papacy and put it on somebody way off in the distant future. And then the papacy is free, not suspect, allowed to prosper and practice throughout all of the Christian era, persecuting the saints, shedding the blood of the martyrs of Jesus, and no one pins the tail on the Antichrist donkey. Then we have the Protestant interpretation of Bible prophecy, the historical interpretation of Bible prophecy that sees the papacy throughout the entire Christian era being the answer, the interpretation, the fulfillment of all the Bible prophecies regarding Antichrist. The papacy and the papacy alone is the biblical, historical, and prophetic Antichrist. To believe otherwise is to deny the historical interpretation of the prophecies and to deny the Protestant Reformation altogether. And to waste the blood of 18 centuries of martyrs. He continues, the latter, that is the historical or the Protestant interpretation of Bible prophecy, regards the prophecies of Daniel, Paul, and John as fully and faithfully setting forth the entire course of Christian history. The former, that is the papal and the futurist interpretation of Bible prophecy, that is the former, dealing chiefly with a future fragment of time at its close. Historicism sees in prophecy the revelation of the entire Christian history, the entire Christian history. Futurism, as believed by the papists, leaves out the entire Christian era. Prophecy doesn't touch it. But those prophecies apply only to a frantic fulfillment of a small fragment of time just before Christ comes, leaving out the entire history of the Christian church. You see how important it is for the papacy to believe in futurism? Do you see how important it is for the success of the reign of Antichrist in the world so that it may continue and prosper and practice? You see how important it is that for the papacy that the Protestants adopt a futurist interpretation, a papal interpretation of the prophecies? You see, if we all return to historicism, the papacy is, well, the tail is pinned on the papal posterior. And the papacy is destroyed. Just like he was during the Protestant Reformation. Why? Because they were all historicists. But now because, and I use the word freely, now that we all believe, like the papists, in a future fulfillment of the Antichrist at the very end of time, we're all ready to put on our Sunday best and go to Rome and just kiss the ring of the Pope. The ecumenical movement, that's what it is. Putting on your Sunday best, going to Rome, bending on your knee in front of a sinful, wicked man, and kissing his ring and his feet and his belly. You see what danger there is in falsely interpreting the prophecies of Daniel and Paul and John? Those who have never touched the unclean thing are now in bed with her. He says the former, or the futurist system of interpreting the prophecies, is now held, strangely to say, by many Protestants. But it was first invented by Jesuit Ribera at the end of the 16th century. Why? To relieve the papacy from the terrible stigma cast upon it by the Protestant interpretation. Now, do I need to remind my listeners when this book was written? This book was written in the late 1880s. And even then, he confirms that Protestants even then were beginning to yield to this futurist abomination. And beginning, obviously, as a result, to sympathize with the papacy. I'm sorry, Mr. Pope, you've been wrongly accused. The Protestant reformers were wrong. The prophecies are future. Therefore, they can't apply to you. You have been wrongly accused by we disobedient Protestants. How may we amend our error, Mr. Pope? What might we do to exonerate ourselves before your pious throne? What must we do to come home? That's the ecumenical movement. It began when Protestants began to believe in futurism way back in the late 1800s. A diabolical scheme created by Satan through his Jesuits and through his popes to deceive the whole world, most principally of which is the world of Jesus Christ, his believers. And cause them to give up the hope that they once had in Christ and to receive that hope once again from the papacy. Unbelievable apostasy. Words cannot describe the horror that I have just painted for you. What H. Grattan Guinness has just painted for you. He says the former or futurist system of interpreting the prophecies is now held, strange to say, by many Protestants. But it was first invented by the Jesuit Ribera at the end of the 16th century to relieve the papacy from the terrible stigma cast upon it by the Protestant interpretation. This interpretation was so evidently the true and intended one that the adherents of the papacy felt its edge must at any cost be blunted. If the papacy were the predicted Antichrist, as the Protestants asserted, there was an end of the question, and separation from it became an imperative duty. It still is an imperative duty. Come out of the Roman Catholic Church before it's too late. I'll see you next week.